Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the writings of the Apostle Paul. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in the next few minutes, we will be introduced to the letter Paul wrote to the church at Galatia. Let's begin by sharing the screen. And reminding ourselves that Paul wrote 13 of the books in the New Testament. He wrote letters, or what are sometimes called epistles. Some of those letters were written to individuals. Some of them were written to churches. His letters span approximately 15 years, and they're not presented to us in the English Bible in chronological order, but that's our focus. And so in a previous lesson, we had looked at 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Today, we're going to look at Galatians, and then in future lessons, we'll look at 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, and the remaining letters. Galatians was written in either 48 AD or 52 to 55 AD. Some scholars opt for the earlier time period, others for the later time period. We're going with the 52 to 55 AD time period. Galatia was not a city. Galatia was a Roman province, and it sits squarely in what would be, or what is, modern-day Turkey. There were also some regions within Galatia, such as Pisidia or Lycaonia. There are four cities that are mentioned in the New Testament from the area of Galatia. They're Antioch, sometimes known as Antioch of Pisidia or Little Antioch. It was a commercial and military center of southern Galatia. There's also Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Paul preached in Galatia on all three of his missionary trips, but he always preached in the southern part of Galatia, which raises an interesting question of why. Why would he focus his efforts there? And perhaps we should stop at this point and take a look at a map. So let me share a different screen with you. By way of reminder, in the bottom right corner of this map is Jerusalem, where the Gospels in the first 7, 8, 9, 10 chapters of Acts took place. You see Antioch here. That's not the Antioch that I just mentioned. Galatia is here. It's a landlocked province. And the cities that I had mentioned, including Antioch of Pisidia, would be down in this area. Even though you see the word Colossae, Colossae is actually this dot. So it's in a different region. It's in what's known as Asia Minor. So in this area around here is where Paul would have done his preaching. But he never preached in this northern part that we're aware of. And so that's one of the things we're considering of why was the focus always in this part? Well, the answer to that is going to be that there's a trade route that went through here. So if you'll notice, this would have been very easy to travel through this area. Let me get back to the PowerPoint slides. As I mentioned, there was an important trade route that ran through southern Galatia, and Antioch of Pisidia was an important both commercial center and military center in the southern part of Galatia. Because it was the smaller of the two Antiochs, it's sometimes known as Little Antioch or Smaller Antioch. There were cities in northern Galatia, and there was a road that ran from east to west in northern Galatia. The problem was there were mountains in the middle of Galatia, and reaching the northern part of Galatia, particularly for someone who was coming from Jerusalem, would have been very difficult. So a person could travel fairly easily along the southern part of Galatia because of the major trade route, or they could travel fairly easily across the northern part of Galatia because of the Egnatian Way. But trying to get from north to south in Galatia posed quite a challenge. And so that's probably why all of Paul's recorded time in Galatia is in the southern part of the province. We should also mention that Paul often focused his ministry in areas that had a large population. And sometimes that also meant that they had a seaport there. And so because of this major trade route that moved through the southern part of Galatia, that's where a lot of the population was located. And so that's where Paul was going to focus his attention. And his reasoning was that not only could he preach to the people who lived there on a permanent basis, but also because so many people were coming and going as a part of their business, he could also preach to them, and potentially they could take the gospel back to wherever they lived with them. So during Paul's first missionary journey, which is Acts 13 and a good portion of Acts 14, we're told about his time in Galatia. He was driven out of Antioch. He had to flee from Iconium. He was stoned in Lystra, and he preached in Derbe. And then he turned around and went right back to the same cities. And so things did not start particularly well in Galatia. And this would have been one of Paul's first stops on his first missionary journey. So the early part of his mission efforts met with quite a bit of resistance. Paul was also in Galatia on his second missionary journey, Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. And something very, very important happened during the second missionary trip, and that was he met Timothy. The believers in that area spoke very highly of Timothy, who probably was a teenager at that point in time. But Paul was so impressed that he invited Timothy to come along with him, and Timothy would become an extremely important member of Paul's missionary team, and he would consider Timothy to be his son in the faith. Paul also went through Galatia on his third missionary journey, Acts chapter 18, just a single verse there, verse 23. It just said he passed through the region. Now, he probably stopped, but there's no record of how long he was there, who he spoke to, etc. So Paul was in Galatia on all three of his missionary trips. Because so much time was spent in Galatia during the first missionary journey, and so many details are included for us in Acts, many scholars believe that the letter to the Galatians that we're going to look at would have been written soon after the first missionary trip. The question becomes, why was it written? Paul had just been there. He had spread the gospel. He had established some churches. And then because he was a missionary, he did not stay there permanently. He moved on to continue preaching in other areas. What happened was, once he left, a group of people known as Judaizers came in behind him. What was a Judaizer? A Judaizer was a Jewish individual who had heard the gospel and converted to Christianity. If you go back to Acts chapter 6 and the days and the weeks immediately after the day of Pentecost, when Peter preached the sermon that really began the church in Jerusalem, many Jewish people converted to Christianity. Acts chapter 6, verse 7 says, the number of disciples continued to increase greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were becoming obedient to the faith. And that's good. The challenge was that Jewish was a cultural identity, not just a religious affiliation. And so some of the Jewish Christians wanted the non-Jewish Christians to follow the law of Moses, and they wanted their males to be circumcised. Acts chapter 15, verse 5. So once Paul had left Galatia after his first visit there on his first missionary journey, the Judaizers came in behind him. And they told the Christians in Galatia, well, Paul is not a 100% apostle. He's not a full-fledged there from the beginning apostle. And they said, and by the way, Paul didn't really tell you everything. He told you some of the things that you need to know as a Christian, but he didn't tell you everything. And so it's a good thing we're here, because we'll fill in some of the details he left out. So in the letter of Galatians, Paul has to do a couple of things. First of all, he has to defend his apostleship, that he is a legitimate apostle. Chapter 1, verse 12, he said, I received a revelation directly from Jesus. And if you go to Acts chapter 9, it's about Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. That's what he's referring to. So Jesus spoke to me directly and called me to be a minister of his. Acts chapter 2, verses 6 through 9, he said, the people that you know well, the people in Jerusalem who are so well respected, they didn't add anything to my commission as an apostle. That came directly from the Lord himself. In fact, he said in Galatians chapter 2, I am the one who actually had to confront Peter because he was doing some things that he should not have been doing. I'm the one who corrected him. So Paul is defending his commission as an apostle. He then defends the gospel that he preached to them. Galatians 1, 8 through 10, he says, if anyone tries to teach you something different than what I taught you, let that person be cursed. And he even says it again. This is so important. I'm going to say it one more time. If anyone tries to teach you a different gospel than what I taught you, let that person be cursed. And he was very upset with the Christians in Galatia chapter 3, verse 1. He says, you foolish Galatians, who has come in and deceived you? What he's saying is, I told you the truth. I told you the whole gospel. Why have you let yourselves be tricked into thinking something else? The Judaizers had come to Galatia and they had convinced the Christians there that Jesus was not enough for salvation, that it was Jesus and following the law of Moses. So Paul uses chapter 3 and chapter 4 to explain the purpose of the law of Moses. It certainly had a purpose, but then he explains why faith in Jesus is superior to the law of Moses. So chapter 3, verse 13, he said, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. The law had a purpose. It was a tutor. It was a teacher. It was leading us to Christ, to the time that Christ would be revealed. But now that Jesus has come, we don't need the tutor anymore. We don't need the law of Moses anymore. It served its purpose. It was a very important purpose, but it has been served because Jesus is now here. And we are children of God, not through our faith in the law of Moses. We're children of God through our faith in Jesus Christ. In other words, what Paul is saying is salvation is through Jesus Christ, period. Not Jesus Christ plus anything else. Jesus Christ, period. If anyone tries to add to that, Paul says, then the grace that comes to us through Jesus no longer has any value. So this is the you can fall from grace verses. What he's saying is, if you try to get your salvation through anything other than or beyond Jesus Christ, then that marvelous gift of grace that comes through Jesus no longer has any value to us. And finally, he says, you're free in Christ. Christ has set us free. The grace that comes to us provides our salvation and gives us freedom to live fully in Christ. So he said, don't give up your freedom to start following a system of rules. We had one of those and it didn't work. He says, use your freedom to serve one another. Don't just indulge yourself and your human desires, but serve other people, living out your faith because of all that Christ has done for you. Well, that's our introduction to Galatians. Over the next few days, I hope that you will take some time to read through the letter. It's not especially long, but it's incredibly important. And it's one of the great, great letters talking about grace. And it's important to us as Christians. In our next lesson, we will look at 1 Corinthians. I hope you can join us.